The day Alice Boone rode into Dusthaven, Texas with nothing but a carpet bag, a loaded derringer she did not know how to fire, and a dead husband's debts trailing behind her like storm clouds, she told herself she was done trusting men. And then Monroe Wilcox walked out of the livery stable and caught her horse before it threw her into the dirt, and everything she had promised herself began to crumble at the edges. It was the spring of 1874, and Dusthaven was the kind of town that the railroad had almost reached and then reconsidered, leaving it stranded between civilization and wilderness like a word on the tip of a tongue. Main Street was a long strip of sun-baked clay flanked by a general store, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a small church that doubled as the town meeting hall, a land office, a doctor's surgery, and a scattering of homes that petered out into open range on both ends. The sky above it was the particular shade of blue that only exists in West Texas in April, so deep and cloudless it looked painted rather than real. Alice had come from San Antonio by stagecoach, a 3-day journey that had left her dress dusty, her nerves frayed, and her resolve exactly as thin as paper held against a lantern. She was 24 years old, brown-haired and sharp-eyed, with a jaw that set firm when she was frightened and hands that stayed steady even when her heart did not. She had been married at 18 to a man named Gerald Boone, a charming speculator who had promised her half the world and delivered about a quarter of one county before a bad business deal, and a fever took him 2 winters past. What he left behind was a modest pile of debt, a house she could no longer afford, and the unshakable sense that Alice was capable of more than she had yet been allowed to show. Her cousin Margaret had written from Dusthaven in February. The letter described a town growing faster than it had hands to grow with, a man named Carson who ran the general store and needed a bookkeeper, a room available above the milliner's shop, and enough promise in the surrounding range land that a woman with sense could build something real. Margaret had not mentioned Monroe Wilcox. Perhaps she had not thought to, or perhaps she had known that mentioning him would complicate the arithmetic. Alice's horse, a hired animal from the San Antonio Stage Company that was supposed to be returned at the Dusthaven relay point, chose the precise moment of arriving on Main Street to decide it had endured quite enough. It shied sideways at the sight of a tin bucket rolling in the wind, and Alice, who was a reasonable but not exceptional rider, grabbed the saddle horn and felt the world tilt in a deeply alarming direction. Then a hand closed around the bridle, firm, unhurried, the way a person touches something they have no intention of letting go. "Easy now," the man said, and it was not entirely clear whether he was speaking to the horse or to Alice, but either way it worked. The horse settled. Alice settled. She looked down. Monroe Wilcox was 30 years old that spring, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who work with their bodies, as a matter of course rather than vanity, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that had been weathered to a kind of fine-grained quality by sun and wind. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that Alice would spend considerable time afterward failing to name precisely. He was not classically handsome in the way of men in periodicals, but he had the kind of face that a person kept wanting to look at, as if there were something new in it each time. He was wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled, worn denim trousers, and boots that had seen considerable acreage. He had a hat pushed back on his head, and a smear of grease on his left forearm from whatever he had been doing in the livery stable before her horse interrupted him. He did not seem particularly impressed by his own heroism, which Alice found she preferred to the alternative. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "Horse doesn't like the wind today," he said, as if explaining the horse's behavior rather than accepting her gratitude. "You'll want to keep a firmer grip on the reins if you're going anywhere near the south end of town. There's sheet metal loose on Haggerty's roof and it bangs something terrible." "I will remember that," Alice said. She became aware that she was still gripping the saddle horn and released it with a degree of dignity she was not entirely sure she had earned. He released the bridle and stepped back, tilting his head slightly. "You're new." "I am," she said. "Alice Boone. I've come to work for Mr. Carson at the general store." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, more the precursor to one, the country just before the border. "Monroe Wilcox," he said. "I run the livery. You'll need to return that animal." "I was just about to do that," Alice said, which was almost true. "I'll take the reins, then, if you want to step down." She dismounted with what she hoped was grace and handed him the horse's reins. Their fingers did not touch, but the exchange was close enough that she was aware of the distance that remained. She picked up her carpet bag from where it had been hanging from the saddle horn and straightened her jacket and told herself, very firmly, that the flicker in her chest was simply the aftermath of nearly being thrown, nothing more. She was lying, but it was a very early lie, and she could not yet know the full cost of it. Margaret was waiting at the end of the street in front of the milliner's shop, waving with the particular enthusiasm of a woman who has been largely right about something and intends to enjoy the fact. She was 30, 2 years older than Alice, with red hair and a face full of practical good humor. She wrapped Alice in a hug that smelled of flower and rose water. "You made it," Margaret said. "Was the stagecoach dreadful?" "The first day was fine," Alice said. "The second was educational. The third was an exercise in humility. Come on, then. I'll show you the room, and then we'll get you something to eat, and you can start at Carson's on Monday." Old Hattie Carson is running the books herself at the moment, and she's convinced herself she's doing it right, but she is absolutely not doing it right, and someone who actually knows numbers is going to save that family a considerable amount of money. Alice laughed, and it was the first honest laugh she had managed in 3 days. "I know numbers," she said. "I know you do," Margaret said, and linked her arm through Alice's. "Now, did you see the livery man, Monroe Wilcox? He's good people, Alice. One of the genuinely good ones." "He caught my horse," Alice said. "Did he?" Margaret smiled in a way that contained entire paragraphs. "Well, that sounds about right." Alice decided not to pursue the paragraph. The room above the milliner's was small and clean, with a south-facing window that let in long rectangles of afternoon light. There was a narrow bed with a good quilt, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a shelf that previous occupants had left a handful of books on. Alice set her carpet bag down and stood at the window and looked at the street below, where the afternoon was moving along in its ordinary business. She could see the livery stable from here. The open double doors, the shadow of activity inside. She turned away from the window and began to unpack. She started at Carson's general store the following Monday, and by Wednesday she had identified 3 bookkeeping errors that had been accumulating for 18 months, recovered $11 in miscalculated credit, and reorganized the ledger system in a way that made Hattie Carson press her hands together and say, with feeling, that Alice Boone was an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. Alice had smiled and said she was just doing her job, but it felt good, genuinely good, to be competent at something visible, to have the evidence of her ability written plainly in the columns of a ledger. The store was busy. Dusthaven drew people from 60 miles of surrounding ranch land, and on any given day the store would see cowboys stopping in for tobacco and canned goods, ranchers' wives selecting dress fabric, farmhands picking up hardware, and a steady traffic of the kind of men who inhabited the in-between spaces of frontier towns, travelers, prospectors, men between one thing and the next. Alice learned the inventory within a week and the regular customers within 2, and she found she liked the work enormously, liked the small conversations that punctuated the arithmetic, liked being useful. Monroe Wilcox came in on the Thursday of her first week to pick up a box of horseshoe nails and a length of chain. He did not make a particular production of noticing her, but he noticed her, and when he settled up at the counter he said, "How are you finding the town, Mrs. Boone?" "Better than expected," she said honestly, and something in him relaxed slightly, as if this information mattered. "The south wind dies down in May," he said. "It's a better place once the wind settles." "I'll look forward to that," she said. He collected his goods and tipped his hat and left. Alice watched the door close behind him and then deliberately directed her attention back to the ledger, where the numbers were reliable and had the considerable virtue of not making her chest do anything unusual. The weeks found their rhythm. April turned warmer, the wind began to gentle as Monroe had promised it would, and Dusthaven revealed itself in layers. There was a church social on the third Sunday, where Alice met the Haggerty family and the McAllister family, and a woman named Dolores Ruiz who ran the laundry and had opinions about everything that Alice found bracing and enjoyable. There was a town meeting in the second week of May about a proposal to build a proper schoolhouse, which Alice attended because she thought it was important and stayed for because the argument was fascinating. There was a Saturday afternoon dance in the open space behind the Copper Spur, with a fiddle player and a banjo, where Alice allowed herself to be pulled into a reel by Margaret, and discovered that she had missed dancing more than she had realized. Monroe was at the dance. He stood at the edge of the gathering in the way of a man who is present without requiring to be at the center of things, and he danced once with old Mrs. Haggerty, who was 70 and relentless and brooked absolutely no refusal. After Mrs. Haggerty had been returned to her chair, Monroe stood with two other men, one of them the town sheriff, a steady, heavy-handed man named Garrett, and the other a rancher Alice had not yet met, and talked about range and water rights with the concentrated attention of men for whom these things were genuinely urgent questions. Alice found herself watching him across the space between them, the late afternoon light falling gold on the dusty street, the fiddle singing something slow now, couples turning in easy circles. She was watching the way he listened, the particular quality of his attention, full and still, not planning his own response while someone else was speaking. Gerald had never listened like that. Gerald's eyes had always been moving, calculating, finding the angle. Monroe's eyes stayed on whoever was speaking to him as if that person were the most interesting thing within reach. She pulled her attention away sharply. She had been in Dusthaven for 5 weeks. She had made herself one promise, that she would not be stupid again. She had every intention of keeping it. But then the dance ended and people drifted, and Monroe walked past her on his way to the water barrel and paused and said, "You dance well, Mrs. Boone." "You were watching," she said, and immediately wished she had phrased that differently because it sounded both more and less than she had intended. He did not look away. "I was," he said simply, as if it were an uncomplicated fact that required no defense. "You looked like you were enjoying yourself." "I was," she said, echoing his directness without quite meaning to. A pause, the kind that has weight without being uncomfortable. "I think you'll like it here," he said, "when you've been here long enough for it to feel like yours." She thought about that for a long time afterward. The particular generosity of it, the assumption that she would stay, that this would become hers, that the belonging was simply a matter of time. June came. Alice learned that Monroe had come to Dusthaven 7 years earlier from a place called Caldwell County, which was a different kind of Texas flatter, more austere. He had worked 2 years at another man's livery before buying this one when the previous owner decided to try his luck in California. He had 160 acres of land east of town that he worked in the early mornings and evenings around the livery's demands. Not yet enough cattle to call himself a rancher in any serious sense, but working toward it with the methodical patience that seemed to characterize everything he did. He had no family within 500 miles. Alice learned these things the way you learn things in a small town in pieces, from multiple sources, assembled gradually into a portrait. Dolores Ruiz told her about the land. Margaret mentioned Caldwell County, old Mrs. Haggerty, who considered information about everyone within a 5-mile radius to be essentially her property, provided the earlier history of the livery. And Monroe himself told her about his family, or the absence of it, one Wednesday morning when he stopped at the store for coffee beans and found Alice alone for 20 minutes while Hattie Carson was in the back storeroom. "Do you have family near?" she asked. It was a natural enough question. She had been asked it herself a dozen times. "Not anymore," he said. "My mother died 3 years ago, my father before that. I had a brother, but he went north after the war and I lost track of him somewhere in Kansas." She heard something in it, not self-pity, because Monroe did not seem to have much use for self-pity, but a kind of settled acknowledgement of loss, the way a landscape settles after an earthquake and becomes simply the new shape of things. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a while ago," he said. "You have family here besides Mrs. Calder." "Margaret is my only family left," Alice said. "My parents both died when I was young. My husband Gerald died 2 winters ago." "I heard," he said. "I'm sorry for that. He was not always easy," she said, and then was surprised that she had said it, because she had not said it to anyone in Dusthaven. It was true, and it was not disrespectful, but it was real, and she had been keeping real things in boxes since she arrived. Monroe did not respond with the uncomfortable silence or the hasty condolence that she expected. He simply looked at her steadily and said, "I imagine you're glad to be building something of your own." The accuracy of this struck her somewhere precise and undeniable. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what I am doing." "Good," he said, as if her determination were a personally satisfying thing to him. That was the conversation that cracked the box open, she thought later. Not anything dramatic. Just the simple act of being seen clearly by someone who did not have a stake in the seeing. It was in July that things shifted. The summer had settled into its full brutal weight by then, the kind of Texas heat that makes the air above the road shimmer like a mirage and drains the color from the sky to a white-hot pale. Alice had developed a routine early mornings at the store before the heat built, a rest in the midday, back to the books in the cooler afternoon. She was saving money with a disciplined pleasure that she found genuinely satisfying, keeping a careful account of her own finances in a small notebook that she kept in the drawer of her writing desk. On the afternoon of the 14th of July, a man rode into Dusthaven who did not fit the geography. His name, Alice learned afterward, was Dale Fitch, and he was from nowhere good and heading somewhere worse. He was a broad, heavy man in his 40s, with the look of someone who had been skirting the law for long enough that it had become his natural habitat, and he rode in with 2 other men who had the same quality of worn-down menace. They went to the Copper Spur and drank, which was not particularly unusual. They had loud words with a card player at the corner table, which was more concerning. And then, on their way out, Dale Fitch saw the general store and apparently decided it looked like an opportunity. Alice was alone in the store. Hattie Carson had gone home with a headache. Her husband was expected back from a supply run by 4 o'clock, but it was not yet 3. The bell above the door rang and the 3 men came in, and Alice knew immediately, with the particular animal intelligence that women who have had to manage difficult men develop as a survival skill, that this situation required careful handling. "Afternoon," she said, and kept her voice steady and her posture behind the counter, which created at least the impression of structure. Dale Fitch looked around the store with the assessing eye of a man calculating value. "Pretty nice place," he said. "You run this yourself." "The owners will be back shortly," Alice said. "Can I help you find something?" "I reckon you can," he said, and rested his hands on the counter in a way that was designed to be intimidating. "We need some supplies for the road. Flour, salt pork, whatever else you've got that's worth having. And we're a little short of cash money at present, so we'd appreciate if you could see your way clear to extending us some credit." Alice looked at the ledger, which was open on the counter, as if consulting it. "I'm afraid we don't extend credit to parties we don't know," she said. "It's store policy, but if you have funds I'm happy to sell you what you need at fair prices." The second man, younger, with a raw, restless energy, laughed in a way that did not contain any humor. The third man had drifted toward the fabric bolts and was touching things in a way designed to communicate that he could take whatever he liked. "Store policy," Dale Fitch said, as if repeating a foreign word. "That's real nice. But we're not asking exactly." The bell above the door rang again. Monroe Wilcox came in the way he always came in, unhurried, not particularly dramatic, but his eyes read the room in about 2 seconds flat, and something in him settled into a different quality of stillness. The way a man goes quiet when he has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the moment to act. "Fitch," he said, which told Alice that he knew this man, and not in any good way. Dale Fitch straightened and turned. Something moved in his face, not quite respect, but the recognition of a variable he had not factored in. "Wilcox," he said, "you paying for your supplies or leaving?" Monroe said. His voice was exactly the same as it was when he was discussing the price of horseshoe nails, which somehow made it more rather than less effective. A long beat. The restless younger man glanced at Fitch. The one near the fabric bolts had gone still. "We were just passing through," Fitch said finally, and there was enough in that capitulation to tell Alice that Monroe had some history with this man that gave him a weight Fitch was unwilling to test. "Then keep passing," Monroe said. The 3 men filed out. The bell above the door rang twice, once in, once out, and then the store was quiet again, and Alice realized that her hands were pressed flat against the counter with more force than was strictly necessary. Monroe stood in the middle of the store until the sound of horses retreated down the street, and then he exhaled slowly and looked at Alice. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, and then, more honestly, "I was a little frightened." "That was a reasonable response," he said. "Fitch has been working the counties east of here. He's not someone to push back on alone." "I wasn't entirely alone," she said. "You came in." "I saw the horses out front," he said. "Recognized Fitch's roan." He paused. "I should have come in sooner." "You came when it counted," she said. He looked at her across the store, and for a moment the afternoon light and the dust motes and the smell of coffee and leather and dry goods were all simply the backdrop to the specific fact of the two of them looking at each other with something that had been building for 3 months and was now, finally, too large to be contained in any of the boxes she had been keeping it in. "I'm glad you're all right," he said. "I'm glad you own a livery on the main street," she said. He almost smiled. "I'll let Sheriff Garrett know about Fitch. They should be headed out of the county." He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat, which seemed to be a thing he did when he was uncertain how to exit a conversation. "You should probably lock up early today." "Probably," she agreed. He turned to go and then turned back in the doorway with the afternoon sun making an approximate halo of the dust behind him. "Mrs. Boone," he said. "Alice." He had not used her given name before. It landed somewhere she was not prepared for. "Would you do me the honor of having supper with me on Saturday? At the hotel dining room, if you're willing. I would like—" He paused, and she could see him being precise with himself, choosing real words rather than convenient ones. "I would like the chance to know you better, properly, if that's something you'd want." Alice thought of all the promises she had made to herself on the stagecoach from San Antonio. She thought of Gerald and the quarter of a county he had delivered instead of half the world. She thought of the way Monroe had said your own building something of your own, as if he already understood the most important thing about her. "Saturday," she said. "Yes." The smile that arrived on his face then was not the careful almost smile she had seen before. It was full and genuine and slightly surprised, as if even having asked the question he had not been entirely confident in the answer, and it transformed his face into something she felt she could look at for a very long time without reaching any kind of adequate conclusion. "Saturday," he said. "I'll come at 6. He went. Alice stood in the quiet store and pressed her fingers to her lips and then laughed, softly, alone, in the long afternoon light. She told Margaret that evening over supper, and Margaret put her fork down and clasped her hands and said, "I knew it. I have known it since April." "You don't know anything yet," Alice said. "It's one supper." "Alice," Margaret said patiently. "Monroe Wilcox has not had supper with a woman in this town in the 7 years he has lived here. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, a very considerable something." Alice refused to let this information make her heart do anything undignified, and she was only partially successful. Saturday came. Alice wore her best dress, which was a deep blue-green that Margaret told her made her eyes look like October sky. and she did her hair with more care than usual, and then took some of it down again because she did not want to look as if she had tried too hard, and then put it back up because she was allowed to try, and arrived downstairs at 5 minutes to 6 feeling both more excited and more terrified than she had felt about anything in 2 years. Monroe arrived at exactly 6, which she found she had somehow expected. He had cut his hair and was wearing a coat that fit him well and had his hat in his hands rather than on his head, and he looked at her in her blue-green dress with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and not entirely succeeding. "You look wonderful," he said, and it sounded exactly like what it was, a man telling the complete, uncalculated truth. "Thank you," she said. "You look very well yourself." The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Dusthaven, which placed it somewhere between a ranch house kitchen and a proper restaurant from any larger city. But it had tablecloths and candles and a cook who could do things with beef that were genuinely impressive. And Alice found that she did not mind any of the gaps between this and more elegant places she had eaten, because the man across the table from her was more interesting than any decor. They talked for 3 hours. This was the real beginning of knowing each other, not the fragments collected through town gossip or the careful exchanges across a store counter, but the full, sustained conversation of two people who have decided to be honest with each other and are finding, with a kind of quiet joy, that there is a great deal to be honest about. Monroe told her about Caldwell County and his father, who had worked a small cattle operation and had the habit of silence that Monroe had inherited and was still learning to balance against the requirements of actual human connection. He told her about the war. He had been 16 when it started, too young to serve but not too young to understand what it cost, and the way it had changed the world he grew up in, the way the Texas he had been born into was a different country by the time he was 20. He told her about 7 years of building the livery from a single stall operation into something real, about the land he was working east of town, about the specific hope he had for it, which was patient and detailed and entirely his own. She told him about San Antonio and her parents' early deaths, and the aunt who had raised her with brisk affection, and learning accounting from a neighbor who ran a dry goods business and needed help. She told him about Gerald, not the full story, because the full story was complicated and she was not ready to hand all of it to another person yet, but enough. The charm that had been real before it became a performance. The way hope and disappointment had braided together into something she had only recently begun to untangle. "You are capable of being deceived," Monroe said. "That's not the same as being foolish." "Most people find it hard to distinguish between the two," she said. "Most people aren't paying close enough attention," he said. She looked at him across the candlelight. "You pay close attention," she said. "I try to," he said. "I think it's the most important thing a person can do for other people, show up and actually look." She thought of all the times she had wished to be seen in the specific way he meant, not evaluated, not managed, not reflected back at the angle most convenient for someone else's purposes, simply looked at, known. "I think you're right," she said. They walked back along Main Street when the dinner was done, in the warm night air that smelled of dust and sage and the particular sweetness of a Texas evening after a hot day. The stars were enormous, the way they are in places where there is enough sky to contain them properly. At the door of the milliner's shop, Monroe stopped and turned to face her and said, "I would like to see you again, and I want to be plain about why, so there's no confusion. I am not looking for a convenient arrangement. I am looking at you specifically, Alice, and hoping you might be interested in being looked at." It was perhaps the most direct and careful and terrifying thing anyone had ever said to her, and she stood in the starlight and felt the last of the boxes she had been keeping things in simply dissolve. "I think," she said carefully, "that I might be interested in that." He smiled. "Good," he said, and the word was exactly the same one he had used when she told him she was building something of her own, carrying the same weight of quiet satisfaction. "Good night, Alice." "Good night, Monroe." She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while, not thinking anything in particular, just feeling the shape of what was happening and finding, to her own cautious surprise, that it did not frighten her as much as she had expected it would. August arrived with its fullness. Monroe and Alice took to walking on Sunday evenings after church out past the edge of town, where the road became open range, along the creek bed that was running low but not dry, through the long grass that the summer had turned to a color between gold and amber. These walks had a quality that Alice had not experienced in her adult life, a combination of ease and aliveness, the sense of being both comfortable and keenly present simultaneously. Monroe showed her his land on the third Sunday of August. He drove her out in his wagon, east of town, to the 160 acres that he had claimed, and was quietly and persistently making into something. There was a creek that ran along the northern edge, spring-fed and reliable even in summer. There were live oaks along the higher ground. There was a small house, not grand but built well, with solid walls and a good roof and a porch that faced southwest toward the evening light. "It needs work," he said, which was honest because it did, but it was the kind of work that was about building rather than repair, which is a different thing entirely. "I can see what it will be," Alice said. He looked at her and then looked at the land, and she understood that these two looking-ats were related, that she was inside the vision in a way that neither of them had said out loud yet, but that both of them were now aware of. "The creek is the important thing," he said. "Water rights are everything out here. I have good water." "You do," she said, and she was talking about the creek, but she was also obscurely talking about something else. They had their first real disagreement in September, which was perhaps overdue. Monroe had heard from Sheriff Garrett that a new section of land adjacent to his eastern boundary was being claimed by a man named Proctor, a large operation rancher from the next county who had a habit of expanding his holdings through the kind of pressure that was technically legal and morally questionable. Monroe's response to this threat was to say very little and go quieter than usual, which Alice initially read as composure, but which she eventually recognized as something closer to withdrawal. "You're not going to fight this," she said on a Wednesday evening when she had stopped by the livery on her way home and found him replacing a saddle rigging with the intense focus of a man who is thinking about something other than saddle riggings. "I'm thinking about how to fight it," he said. "By going silent," she said. "That's not fighting." He set the rigging down and looked at her with a slightly startled expression that told her he was not accustomed to being challenged in quite this register. "I'm careful," he said. "I don't move until I know my ground." "There's careful and there's frozen," she said. "From where I'm standing you look a little frozen." A pause. He turned this over. "What would you do?" He said, and it was a genuine question, not a defensive one. "I'd go to the land office," she said. "I'd look at every document related to that boundary. I'd get it all in writing, properly witnessed, before Proctor can establish any kind of precedent. Numbers and documents are what I know, Monroe, and I know that paper protects you better than silence." He looked at her for a long moment. "Come with me tomorrow," he said, "to the land office. You know what to look for." She did go with him to the land office, and she did find 3 documents that established his boundary claims with unambiguous clarity, and she organized them and had them witnessed by the land office clerk and filed with the county seat. And when Proctor's man came sniffing around the following week, there was nothing for him to find but a clean, clear, properly recorded claim. Monroe looked at the organized files with the expression of a man who has learned something important. "Thank you," he said. "You would have figured it out," she said. "Eventually," he said. "You made it faster." "We made it faster," she said. And that shift from "you" to "we" sat between them like something new and true. October came, with its first real coolness and the particular amber light that falls on Texas in autumn, and the question of what Monroe and Alice were to each other had been answered by every dimension of their daily life, even if it had not yet been said in so many words. They were together in the most complete sense of the word, in each other's thoughts, in each other's plans, in the way the day arranged itself around the expectation of seeing each other. Margaret said, with her typical directness, Alice, that man is in love with you, and you are in love with him. I am stating this as a simple fact. Margaret, Alice said. What? Margaret said cheerfully. I have eyes. The entire town has eyes. You two have been circling each other for 6 months. At some point someone has to say the word. Which of us should say it? Alice asked, more to herself than to Margaret. Whichever one of you is braver, Margaret said. My money is on you, frankly. It was, in fact, Monroe who said it first. He had come to the store on a quiet Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of October to buy a bag of coffee and a newspaper, which he did not actually need, and which Hattie Carson recognized for what it was with a private satisfaction. He waited until Hattie had found something to do in the back storeroom before he set his coffee on the counter and looked at Alice with the full, still attention that she had come to understand meant he was about to say something he had been carefully selecting. I have been thinking about something, he said. All right, she said. I have been thinking that I have not been this happy since before I can clearly remember, he said. And I've been thinking that you are the reason for it. And I've been thinking that I should say that out loud to you, because you deserve to hear it plainly. She looked at him. The afternoon light fell in long, warm bars through the store windows. Outside, the main street of Dusthaven went about its ordinary business, unknowing. I love you, he said. I'm not confused about it, and I'm not in a hurry for anything from you. But I wanted you to know. Alice had not expected the clarity of what she felt when he said it, not the frightening vertigo of the early weeks, not the careful measuring of a woman who has been burned once and is checking the temperature, but something solid and open, like a door swinging wide onto a good view. Monroe, she said, you don't have to, he started. I love you too, she said. I have for some time. I was just being careful. You're allowed to be careful, he said. I know, she said. But I don't think I need to be careful with you. He reached across the counter and took her hand, and they stood like that in the quiet afternoon while outside the ordinary world continued its ordinary business, entirely unaware that something permanent had just arranged itself. Hattie Carson came out of the back storeroom about 3 minutes later, looked at their joined hands, pressed her lips together in a smile she was trying to contain, and said, Monroe, I'll get your coffee wrapped up, with the focused dignity of a woman choosing to be professional about a personally delightful development. On the first Sunday of November, Monroe drove Alice out to his land in the late afternoon, and they sat on the porch of the small house as the sun went down over the southwest range, and the sky went through the whole sequence from blue to gold to rose to the particular purple that happens in the last minutes before dark. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. I want to ask if you'd consider marrying me, he said. Not because it's the expected thing or because it's convenient, but because I want to build this. He gestured at the land, the house, the sky with you. Specifically you. Because you're the person I think with and talk with and want to see at the end of every day. Because you make me better at everything I do, and I'd like to think I do something of the same for you. Alice had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for a proposal that did not have the quality of a transaction. She had been waiting for a man who wanted her Alice herself, the person she actually was, rather than the role she could fill. You do, she said. You absolutely do something of the same for me. Is that a yes? He asked, and something in his voice was almost young, almost uncertain in the way that makes a person's honesty completely audible. Yes, she said. That is very much a yes. He took a small ring from his coat pocket. It was simple, gold with a small turquoise stone that he told her later he had found at the jeweler in the next town over because it was the color of the sky on the day she rode in and nearly got thrown and put it on her finger. She looked at it in the fading light. The sky on that day, she said. The day your horse shied at the bucket, he said. I have never been more grateful to a bucket in my life, she said. He laughed fully, genuinely, and she thought that sound was one she intended to spend a very long time accumulating. The news spread through Dusthaven with the efficient velocity that small towns reserve for information of this quality. By Monday morning, Hattie Carson had apparently told 7 people before Alice even arrived at the store. Dolores Ruiz appeared at the store door before noon to embrace Alice and say, with great feeling, that Monroe Wilcox was a good man, and it was about time someone had the sense to see it. Margaret said nothing at all but simply held Alice very tightly for a long moment and then pulled back and looked at her face and said, "You're happy. Actually, truly happy." "I am," Alice said. "I really am, Margaret." "Good," Margaret said, with an emphasis that was 8 months of hope delivered all at once. The wedding was planned for December, which in any reasonable climate might have seemed rushed, but in the context of two people who had been circling each other for 8 months with complete mutual awareness seemed, if anything, slightly delayed. The church was booked for the 15th. Dolores Ruiz and Hattie Carson undertook the matter of the celebration, with an organizational energy that Alice found both touching and slightly overwhelming. Margaret made Alice's dress from a length of ivory muslin that they had picked out together at the store, working on it in the evenings by lamplight with the focused care of a woman who intends this to be exactly right. The dress was simple and exactly right. On the morning of December the 15th, Alice stood in the back room of the church while Margaret pinned her hair, and the sound of people settling into pews came through the door, and she felt something she had not felt on the morning of her first wedding. She felt calm. Not the false calm of suppressed anxiety, but genuine, solid, ground beneath the feet calm. She knew this man. She knew his silences and his attention and his patience and the exact particular way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him. She knew his values. She knew his fears. She knew where he was headed, and she knew she was headed there with him, and it felt like the truest and most sensible thing she had ever decided. "You're ready," Margaret said. "I am," Alice said. She walked down the aisle of the small church in Dusthaven, Texas on a December morning, with the winter light coming through the plain glass windows and the whole town in the pews watching. And Monroe Wilcox stood at the altar in his good coat with his hat in his hands and his gray-green eyes on her face, and his expression was everything she had needed it to be. She had been wrong about men, and then she had been right about one, which she thought was probably a reasonable average. They said the words that are said at weddings, with the particular weight that those words carry when both people saying them mean every syllable, and when the minister said Monroe could kiss his bride, he did so with the same quality he brought to everything deliberately, genuinely, without performance or haste, and the gathered population of Dusthaven made the collective noise of people who have been waiting for this moment and are satisfied by the result. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was the season of beginning. Monroe and Alice moved into the small house on the eastern land, which Monroe had been working on since October. A new window installed, the porch repaired, the kitchen extended, a proper stove added. Alice brought her carpet bag and her ledger and her small collection of books, and these two sets of belongings settled into the space together with the easy naturalness of things that belong in the same place. Alice continued at Carson's General Store 3 days a week, which she and Monroe had agreed was what she wanted, and which Monroe had made no argument about because he understood the importance of a person having work that was genuinely theirs. On the other days she applied her accounting to the livery's books, which had been in the amiable chaos of a man who is better at horses than figures, and within a month had them in a state of order that Monroe looked at with a species of wonder. "I have apparently been undercharging for farrier work by about 30%, he said. "Yes," Alice said. "For 7 years." "Yes." "How much money does that represent in aggregate?" Alice named a number that she had calculated. Monroe sat down on a hay bale and stared at the middle distance. "We can't get it back," Alice said, not unkindly, "but we won't lose any more of it." "No," he said, "we certainly will not." He looked at her. "What would I do without you?" "Undercharge for farrier work," she said. He laughed and pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest and listened to his heart beat steady, and even in the quiet morning, and found, not for the first time, that this was the best possible place. The spring of 1875 brought the news that the railroad surveyors were coming through again, this time with serious intent. If the railroad came to Dusthaven or near enough to matter, the character of the town would change substantially. Land values would rise, commerce would expand, and Monroe's livery, sitting square on the main road, would either become a more valuable establishment or be rendered less necessary by the new transportation patterns, depending on how the line was laid. Monroe was cautious about the railroad. He had seen what it had done to other towns. Some of them became cities. Some of them became bypassed ghosts. Alice was cautiously optimistic because the general store's accounts told a story of a town that had the bones to grow if it was given the right scaffolding. "The key is the root," she said, one evening on the porch while the spring stars appeared overhead in their extravagant abundance. "If the line comes through the eastern valley, which is the logical route, it will bring a depot within 2 miles of town. That's close enough to benefit from, far enough to avoid the noise and the riffraff that depots sometimes attract. Have you been talking to the surveyors?" he said. "I had a long conversation with one of them at the store on Thursday," she said. "He was buying tobacco and I asked him about the route and he was surprisingly forthcoming." Monroe shook his head, but he was smiling. "You talk to everyone. People tell you things if you ask them," she said, "and if you actually listen to the answer, which I learned from watching you." He looked sideways at her. "You learned listening from me. Your particular variety of it," she said, "the kind that makes people feel worth being heard. A long, comfortable quiet. The night sounds of the range insects, a far-off coyote, the creak of the porch boards." "Alice," he said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "I spent a long time before you," he said, "thinking that being alone was simply the shape of my life. Not tragic, just the shape of it. And I had made a kind of peace with that, or what I thought was peace. And now," she said, "now I understand that it wasn't peace," he said. "It was just the absence of the right company." She put her hand over his on the porch railing and they sat in the vast Texas dark, in the right company. In June of 1875, Alice discovered she was expecting a child. She told Monroe on a Monday morning before he left for the livery, simply and directly, which was the way she had come to tell him everything. He went very still in the way that was his particular form of absorbing something important, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her carefully, as if she were something more valuable than he had words for, and she could feel against her hair that she was almost certain he was blinking hard. "Are you all right?" she said. "More than all right," he said, muffled. "You're not going to cry," she said, more as a gentle observation than anything else. "I am absolutely not going to cry," he confirmed, in the tone of a man who is, at that precise moment, in danger of exactly that. She laughed and held him and felt the extraordinary, ordinary miracle of the morning. The baby came in February of 1876, with the North Texas cold laid heavy over the range and the fire banked high in the stove. Margaret was there, and the doctor and Monroe, who had been told by the doctor to wait outside, and had found this instruction completely impossible to follow, and was therefore technically inside the house but in the hallway, which he felt was a reasonable compromise. The baby was a boy. He came into the world with a full voice and a quantity of dark hair and an immediate, emphatic opinion about the cold, which he expressed loudly and at length. Alice lay back against the pillow and watched Monroe hold his son for the first time, the baby's furious red face going gradually quieter as Monroe moved slightly, instinctively, into the particular gentle rock that seems to be built into people somewhere deep. "Hello," Monroe said to the baby, very quietly. "I'm your father," the baby blinked. "He's thinking about it," Monroe said. Alice laughed, which hurt and was entirely worth it. They named him James, for Monroe's father, and Henry for Alice's, which gave him the full name James Henry Wilcox, which was, they agreed, a sufficiently solid name for a person who had arrived with such a clear sense of his own importance. James Henry Wilcox grew at the rate that babies do when they are well fed and well loved, which is to say faster than anyone is ever fully prepared for. By summer, he was pulling himself upright on the furniture. By October, he was walking with the determined instability of a small person who has recently discovered locomotion and is not going to be deterred by minor setbacks. Monroe carried him through the livery in the mornings, narrating the horses with the seriousness of someone conducting an important tour, and James regarded the horses with the solemn attention of a person taking notes. The railroad came through the Eastern Valley in the autumn of 1876, as Alice had predicted. The depot was built 2 miles from Dusthaven, close enough for the town to benefit substantially. The general store doubled its stock in anticipation of increased traffic. 3 new buildings went up on Main Street. A lawyer arrived. A second doctor arrived. A school was finally built, a real one, with a proper schoolteacher hired from Austin, and Alice volunteered to serve on the school board, which she did with the same competent purposefulness she brought to everything. Monroe expanded the livery, adding 4 new stalls and a dedicated space for wagon repair, and hired 2 young men from the surrounding ranch country to help manage the increased demand. He also broke and sold 4 additional sections of his eastern land to incoming settlers, reinvesting the proceeds in cattle, 40 head of good Texas Longhorn that ranged his remaining acreage and represented the serious beginning of the ranch he had been building toward. They sat on the porch in the evenings while James toddled in the yard under the long summer light, and they talked about the land and the cattle and the store's accounts, and the school board, and the 100 practical interlocking questions of a life being actively built. And underneath all of it ran the constant, unspoken current of 2 people who had found in each other something they had not known to call essential until it was there. Dolores Ruiz stopped Alice on the street one afternoon in the fall of 1876 and said, with her particular directness, "You 2 are different from what I expected, you know." "How so?" Alice said. "Most couples," Dolores said with a philosophical air, "start out like they're the only 2 people in the world, and after a few years they stop looking at each other. I watch people. You and Monroe still look at each other like you're both figuring something out." Alice thought about this. "I think we are," she said. "I think people are always figuring each other out if they're doing it right." Dolores nodded with the satisfaction of a woman whose assessment has been confirmed. "He's a good man, Alice." "And you're good for him." "He's good for me too," Alice said. "That's the important part. It goes both ways." In the spring of 1877, Alice discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Monroe in the evening on the porch, James asleep inside, the stars above the ranch making their slow and ancient argument for wonder. Monroe looked at her, and the same stillness came over him, the same careful quality of absorption, but this time there was no uncertainty underneath it, only the complete, open pleasure of a man for whom this is not a complication but a continuation of everything he has decided he wants. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He pulled her close, and they sat in the warm spring night with the ranch quiet around them and the future already arriving. This baby came in November of 1877, arriving with considerably more efficiency than James had, as if she had heard about the process and decided to be practical about it. She was a girl, dark-haired like her father but with Alice's direct gaze, and she arrived with a composure that the doctor said he had never quite seen in a newborn, and that Alice found entirely plausible. They named her Clara Ruth Wilcox. From the first week of her life, she watched the world with a focused attention that strongly reminded Alice of Monroe, which she said so. And Monroe said that was the greatest compliment he could have received, and Alice said she thought so too. James, who was now a solid, sturdy, horse-obsessed almost 2-year-old, regarded his sister initially with the suspicion appropriate to someone who has just discovered that they are not the only person in the house who requires attention, and then with a gradual and grudging interest that by Christmas had become what could only be described as devoted big brotherhood, which pleased Monroe enormously and made Alice, on more than one occasion, have to look away and blink hard. The years found their fullness. The ranch grew, The livery continued to prosper. The school flourished, and Alice's work on the school board meant that, when the schoolteacher asked for additional funding for books in 1878, there was someone on the board who knew how to make the financial case compellingly, and won it. Monroe hired a full-time ranch hand named a young man named Sam Torres, who was 20 years old and had grown up on a ranch in the next county, and knew cattle with an intimate expertise that Monroe trusted and respected. Sam worked alongside Monroe with the quiet, reliable competence of someone who intends to make a life of what they are good at, and Monroe paid him fairly and treated him decently, which Alice thought was a better indicator of a man's character than almost any other thing. Dale Fitch, the man who had walked into Carson's general store on that July afternoon 3 years past, was arrested in 1878 in a county 2 over, for a crime that Alice did not inquire too closely into. She heard it from Sheriff Garrett, who mentioned it in the store. "That business is wrapped up, at least," the sheriff said, and Alice nodded and felt a quiet relief that she had not known she was still carrying. Margaret, who had brought Alice to Dusthaven and had watched everything that followed with the satisfaction of a woman who has been entirely right, met a man herself in 1877. His name was Ben Calder. She married him that same year, taking his name, and they built a life in Dusthaven that Alice watched with the particular warm pleasure of watching someone you love receive what they deserve. Ben was a carpenter, honest and steady and funny, and he and Monroe liked each other with the genuine ease of men who recognize in each other the same basic orientation toward fairness and plain dealing. The 4 of them had Sunday dinners together that stretched into the evening, the children running in the yard while the adults talked about everything and nothing. And Alice thought, more than once, that this was the life she had not known she was capable of having, this specific gathering of people she had chosen, and who had chosen her, in a place that had become entirely hers. In the summer of 1879, Monroe and Alice rode out to the eastern boundary of the ranch on a clear July morning, the sky enormous and blue, the grass tall after a good spring. The herd was growing 80 head now, a real operation. The house had been expanded twice. The porch was longer, and there were flower beds along it that Alice had planted and tended with the same purposeful attention she brought to ledgers, because she had decided that beauty was also a thing worth investing in. They stood at the crest of the small rise from which the full extent of the ranch was visible. The house, the outbuildings, the water tower Monroe had constructed over the creek, the cattle spread in the middle distance, the line of live oaks along the northern edge exactly as they had been the first time she had seen this land. "Do you remember what you said?" she asked. "The first time you showed me this place." "That it needed work," he said. "And I said I could see what it would be," she said. He looked out at the ranch and then at her. "You could," he said. "You saw it before I did, I think." "I saw it because you showed it to me," she said, "because you trusted me with it." He took her hand. They stood at the crest of the rise in the summer morning and looked at what they had made, and the sight of it was not a small thing, not a modest thing dressed up as more than it was, but a genuine, substantial thing, built from the ground up by 2 people who had each arrived at this particular place in the world alone and had, by some combination of intention and luck and the willingness to look honestly at each other, arrived at it together. "I need to tell you something," Monroe said. She waited. "I think about that day constantly," he said, "the day you rode in." "With the bucket," she said. "With the bucket," he confirmed. "Your horse shied and I caught the bridle and you looked down at me and said thank you like you actually meant it, and I thought—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "I thought there is a woman who is going to be difficult to stop thinking about," he said. She laughed. "Was I difficult?" "Extremely," he said and smiled. "Worth it." "Monroe Wilcox," she said, "you are the best thing that has happened to me in my life." "Including the bucket," he said. "The bucket was instrumental," she said. "But you did the actual work." He pulled her close and she rested against him in the summer sun, and the ranch spread out below them, and in the far distance the town of Dusthaven went about its life, the place that had been a foreign geography 8 months' worth of stagecoach days away and was now, unambiguously and completely, home. They rode back to the house for dinner. Sam Torres had the cattle in the lower pasture. James, who was 3 now and already spending every possible moment in Monroe's wake around the horses, came running from the porch with the velocity of a small person for whom arrival is always urgent. Clara, 18 months old and possessed of a seriousness of purpose that Alice found both amusing and entirely recognizable, was sitting on the porch steps investigating a beetle with focused scientific interest. Monroe swung James up onto the horse for the last 30 feet to the barn, which James received with the ecstasy appropriate to a miracle, and Alice dismounted and scooped Clara up, and Clara allowed this without interrupting her beetle analysis, which Alice chose to interpret as affection. In the kitchen, the smell of the stew Alice had left on the stove before riding out had filled the house with the particular warmth of a home that is, in fact, a home, not a place where people happen to be, but a place that has been made to contain a life. Alice set Clara down and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the barn where Monroe was showing James, with great seriousness, how to check a horse's feet. James was nodding with an expression of absolute concentration. The afternoon light fell long and warm across the yard. She thought about the girl who had stepped off a stagecoach in Dusthaven, Texas, with a carpet bag and a derringer, and a collection of careful promises to herself about what she would and would not allow herself to feel. She thought about how certain she had been that the important thing was to want nothing, to need no one, to build walls sufficiently solid that nothing and no one could disappoint her again. She thought about a bucket rolling in the wind, and a horse shying sideways, and a man's hand closing on the bridle with the unhurried certainty of someone who has no intention of letting go. She thought about gray-green eyes and the first almost smile, and the way he had said building something of your own, as if it were the most natural and supportable thing a person could be doing. She thought about supper at the hotel dining room by candlelight, and Sunday walks along the low creek, and a turquoise ring the color of a Texas sky, and a porch in the evening and the long conversation of a life actually shared. Not the performance of sharing, not the transaction of it, but the real thing, daily and specific and continuously interesting. Monroe came out of the barn with James on his shoulders, and James was wearing Monroe's hat, which fell down over his ears so that it covered most of his face, and Monroe was walking slowly and carefully, narrating something that made James grab the hat brim and push it up so he could see better. Alice went to the door and leaned in the frame and watched them come across the yard. Monroe saw her, and his face did what it had done on the steps of the church on their wedding day, that full, open, specific happiness, and James saw her and shouted "Mama," with the considerable volume of a person for whom every arrival is an occasion. "Dinner," she said. "Dinner," Monroe said, with the same word carrying a completely different set of things: gratitude, contentment, the particular pleasure of a man returning to the specific place he intends to be. They ate together at the kitchen table, the 4 of them, with the ranch quiet outside and the evening beginning its slow descent over the western range, and Alice looked at the faces around the table and felt, not the tentative, provisional happiness of someone who is afraid to believe it, but the full and settled certainty of a woman who has done the right thing and knows it. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not where she had planned, not where she had imagined, but where she was supposed to be. And the man across the table reading a bedtime story to James while simultaneously feeding pieces of bread to Clara with a systematic patience that Alice found endlessly charming, was exactly who she was supposed to be with. There would be more years, more seasons on the ranch, watching the herd grow and the children grow, and the town of Dusthaven grow into something that began to look seriously like the future. There would be difficult seasons. A drought in 1881 that tested the water rights Monroe had fought to establish, and which they managed together by making hard decisions calmly and early rather than hopefully and late. There would be a third child, a boy they named William, born in 1882, who arrived with a remarkable amount of red hair that no one could immediately account for, until Margaret pointed out that red hair ran in her family and therefore in Alice's. And Monroe said that was interesting, and looked at his red-haired son with the same expression of open, undefended love he brought to everything he cared about. James grew into a serious, hoarse-capable young man who was 16 in 1892 and already running his own section of the ranch, with a competence that made Sam Torr's nod, with the appreciation of one professional acknowledging another. Clara developed a ferocious interest in books that Alice fed deliberately and completely, making sure there was never a shortage of reading material in the house. And at 14, she wrote letters to her mother that were, Alice thought privately, better composed than anything most adults managed. William, red-haired and laughing, turned out to be the kind of child who makes friends with everyone in a room within 5 minutes, a talent so unlike his parents' temperaments that they both found it entirely delightful. Dusthaven became, by the 1880s, a real town, a proper newspaper, 2 hotels, a bank, 4 churches, a doctor's surgery with actual surgical capability, and a school that had expanded to 2 rooms and was considering a third. Alice's work on the school board had run 12 years by then, and she was considered, without any particular fuss being made about it, one of the essential people in the town's civic life. The person you went to when the numbers needed to be right, when the argument needed to be made clearly, when something needed to be organized with actual competence. Monroe's ranch was 200 acres by 1885, and 120 head of cattle, and a proper ranch house that bore no resemblance to the small solid structure he had first shown Alice in the summer of 1875, except in its bones and its south-facing porch and the view from the crest of the small rise to the north, which was always the same: the particular enormous sky, the long grass, the live oaks along the water. They still walked out to that rise sometimes, on Sunday evenings when the light was right, and stood looking at the ranch in the same positions they had stood in on the morning of that July in 1879, when they had looked at what they had made and found it genuinely good. In 1887, on an evening in October when the sky had gone the particular rose and gold that Alice associated now with the deepest kind of peace, Monroe said, "Do you ever regret it?" She knew exactly what he meant. "Coming here," she said. "All of it," he said. "The stagecoach, the room above the milliner's, the bucket." She looked at the ranch. She thought of the 13 years between that day and this one, laid end to end, all the work and the difficulty and the seasonal terror and the daily joy and the specific, irreplaceable companionship of the man beside her. "Not for one moment," she said. "Not for one single moment of any of it." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood at the top of the rise in the last of the evening light, with the ranch below them and the sky enormous above them, and the sound of their children, James's voice, deep now, calling something to Sam from the barn, Clara's window lamp beginning to glow as she settled in to read, William's laugh, somewhere in the yard, greeting the evening on his own characteristic terms, surrounding them like everything they had made and everything they were still making. "Good," Monroe said, which was what he had said on a dozen crucial occasions, carrying always the same weight of quiet and complete satisfaction. Alice turned her face up to the October sky, which was going to the deep blue of imminent dark, the first stars beginning their argument, and she thought of the girl on the stagecoach with her carpet bag and her promises and her fear and her capacity for something she had not yet known she would find. She had come to Dusthaven, Texas in the spring of 1874, looking for a fresh start, and she had found something more than that. She had found the specific person who made the starting worth something, the man who had caught her horse and then, slowly and honestly and with complete intentionality, caught everything else. She had been afraid of that once. The weight of being caught, the risk of being held. She understood now that she had confused being held with being confined, and that the difference between the two was the whole difference in the world. Monroe held her exactly as he had held everything that mattered to him since the first day she had seen him, firmly, carefully, with no intention of letting go. And the ranch stretched out in the twilight, and the children's voices rose and fell in the familiar music of an evening at the end of a good day, and the stars came on one by one in the enormous Texas sky, and Alice Boone Wilcox stood at the top of her own small rise of ground, and felt the profound, specific, daily, permanent joy of a woman who has, after everything, arrived exactly where she belongs.